Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The wind had teeth that night, sharp and relentless. It howled through the narrow streets of lower Manhattan, slipping under scarves, slicing through wool coats, and turning breath into steam. Snow fell thick, steady, muting the city's usual chorus of horns and footfalls into a soft, almost reverent silence. Streetlights glowed amber against the storm, halos of warmth in a world turned white. Daniel Hartley sat on a bench beneath the flickering bulb of a bus stop, his shoulders hunched against the cold, hands shoved deep into the frayed pockets of an olive-green coat that had seen better decades. The coat had once belonged to his father, who had worn it while building the frame of their childhood home. Now it served as Daniel's final barrier between himself and the indifference of winter. It was almost 9 p.m., and the bus was late. They were always late when it snowed. Daniel didn't mind. He wasn't in a hurry. There was no meeting to get to, no home to return to, just the inside of a rusting pickup parked behind a warehouse in the Bronx, where a nest of threadbare blankets waited for him. He'd spent the day standing in line at a job fair. 3 rejections, 1 long sigh from a hiring manager who didn't even look up from his phone. He flexed his fingers, numb despite the gloves. His stomach growled, but he ignored it. Hunger had become background noise. He thought of Jonah, his son, now living with a foster family in Queens. Daniel hadn't seen him in nearly 3 months. Not since the day the social worker placed a firm but not unkind hand on his shoulder and said, "Just until you're back on your feet, Mr. Hartley, just until." Daniel repeated the words in his mind like a vow, though most nights it felt more like a lie. A gust of wind made him flinch, and then he heard it, the click of hurried heels against icy pavement. A woman appeared out of the snow, moving fast, her coatless frame trembling beneath a silk blouse and pencil skirt utterly unsuited for the storm. She ducked under the bus shelter, arms wrapped around herself, hair soaked and plastered to her face. Daniel glanced sideways, but said nothing. New York trained you not to ask questions, not to get involved. He pulled his coat tighter around him and looked away. But he could still feel her, the way she shook, the small, sharp sounds of her breath as she tried to warm her hands by rubbing them together. He didn't know what made him do it. Maybe it was instinct, maybe memory. Maybe the look in her eyes reminded him too much of Lily's, that last winter before the cancer one. Whatever it was, he stood slowly, the snow crunching beneath his worn boots, and shrugged off his coat. The cold bit into him immediately. He held it out without a word. The woman blinked at him, startled. "You don't have to do that," she said, her voice raw. Daniel offered a tired smile. "I've already lost enough today. This coat? It's the last thing I have left to give." She hesitated. "But you need it more than I do." "Maybe," he said gently, "but not tonight." He draped it over her shoulders before she could protest again. It was too big on her, the sleeves hanging past her hands, but she pulled it closer anyway. It smelled faintly of old soap and something else. Warmth, perhaps, or kindness long buried. "Thank you," she whispered. Daniel nodded and returned to the bench, folding his arms against the cold. They stood in silence, snow swirling around them. "What's your name?" she asked after a while. "Daniel. I'm Evelyn." He nodded again. "Nice to meet you, Evelyn." They didn't speak after that. The bus arrived in a fog of exhaust and blinding headlights. She stepped toward it, then paused, turning back. "Do you have somewhere to go?" Daniel shrugged. "Somewhere," he said vaguely. She reached in her purse and pulled out a card, pressing it into his hand. "In case you ever need anything." He slipped it into his folder without looking. People said things like that. Most didn't mean it. She boarded the bus. He watched it disappear into the snow, leaving only silence behind. Daniel stood for a moment longer, then turned and began the long walk back to the truck. The snow fell harder now, each flake like a soft whisper. He pulled his thin hoodie tight around him, but it did little against the cold. Still, something burned gently in his chest. Not pain, not exactly. Something else. Hope, maybe. Or its quieter cousin. Back in the truck, he sat with the card in his hand. It read, "Evelyn Moore, CEO, Moore and Maven Technologies." He stared at it, blinked, and let out a small, incredulous laugh. Well, he muttered to himself, that figures. He placed the card carefully in the glove compartment, beside the tin box that held Jonah's last drawing, a stick figure of a man and a boy, holding hands beneath a crooked sun. The caption read, "Me and Dad, forever." Daniel leaned back, wrapped himself in a blanket, and closed his eyes. The storm raged outside, but inside there was a flicker of something else. Not warmth, not yet, but maybe, just maybe, the beginning of it. A coat and a life. K. Produce. Chapter 2. Echoes in the Quiet. The rain had turned to sleet by the time Evelyn Moore reached the elevator of her high-rise apartment on the Upper East Side. Her heels left faint echoes on the marble floor, trailing behind her like shadows she didn't want to acknowledge. The concierge greeted her with his usual half-smile, but she barely looked up, her mind elsewhere, still caught in the flickering memory of a man with tired eyes and a coat far too thin for winter. She stepped into the elevator alone. The doors closed with a whisper, and for the first time in years, Evelyn felt the silence pressing in. When she reached the penthouse, the lights came on automatically. Everything was immaculate. Designed for beauty, not comfort. Marble countertops, glass walls, art pieces chosen for their price, not their sentiment. She slipped out of her shoes, letting them fall to the floor with a careless thud, and walked into the living room. The jacket still clung to her shoulders. She hadn't meant to bring it with her. In fact, she tried to return it. But the man, Daniel, he had said, had shaken his head with a faint smile. "You need it more than I do." She had wanted to argue, but something in his voice stopped her. Something so honest it cut through her practiced attachment like a razor through silk. Only now did she think to take it off. As she folded the jacket over her arm, her fingers brushed something inside the pocket. She paused, reached in. It was a small piece of paper, soft at the edges from wear. Folded twice. A child's drawing. Crayon lines, bright but slightly smudged. Two stick figures under a sun with uneven rays. One labeled Dad, the other simply Me. Between them, a red heart. At the bottom, "I love you, Dad Jonah." Evelyn stood there, unmoving. Her breath caught in her throat. The lights of the city blinked beyond the glass, but she didn't see them. She only saw that shaky little heart. Those 5 misshapen words. Her knees gave slightly as she sat on the edge of the couch. The jacket slipped from her lap and fell to the floor. The drawing remained in her hands. Jonah. She whispered the name aloud, as though trying it on her tongue. Not her child, not her memory. But suddenly, the name felt like it had always been there, knocking on the door of her conscience. She thought of Daniel's face, the way he had clutched that folder to his chest as if it held his very breath. The lines around his eyes not from age, but from loss. And now this, a message not meant for her, but a message that found her anyway. Evelyn stared at the drawing until the lines began to blur. It had been years since she cried, not since she was a girl no one wanted. A girl shuffled through cold homes and colder stairs. She had built her empire on grit and survival, on outworking, outsmarting, outrunning the ghosts of her past. But here, in a penthouse above the city, surrounded by everything she'd earned, Evelyn Moore sat with a child's drawing in her lap and a hollow in her chest she couldn't name. She reached for her phone, then stopped. What would she say? "I found your son's drawing in the jacket you gave me." It sounded ridiculous, but the urge to reach out clawed at her. Instead, she stood, walked barefoot to the small bookshelf in the corner, more decorative than practical. She pulled down a leather-bound journal, untouched since the day she bought it, slipped the drawing between its pages. For safekeeping, for remembering. She made tea she wouldn't drink, sat by the window with her knees pulled close, the jacket now wrapped around her shoulders again. Too big, frayed, and worn, but warmer than anything she'd owned in years. Outside, the city moved on, but inside Evelyn Moore, something had shifted. Not broken, not yet healed, but shifted, gently, irrevocably, and that, somehow, felt like a beginning, where he waited alone. The next morning, Evelyn sat in her office high above the city, wrapped in a wool sweater, the frayed coat folded gently across her lap like a fragile relic. The crayon drawing still rested on her mahogany desk, its edges worn soft from her fingers. Her assistant, Marla, stood quietly by the door, eyes full of the questions she didn't ask. "Can you help me find someone?" Evelyn's voice was quiet but certain, a thread of something raw beneath the composure. Marla blinked once, then nodded. "Of course." Evelyn hesitated. "I don't have a last name. Just Daniel. He was at the 42nd Street bus stop last night. Around 8:30. He gave me his coat." Marla didn't ask more. She only said, "I'll do my best." It took 3 days. 3 days of surveillance footage, transit pass records, pieced together sightings from street vendors and late shift workers. Evelyn didn't. At meeting, she canceled 2 investor calls. She sat in silence and reread the drawing. When Marla returned with a manila folder and set it on the desk, Evelyn didn't move. "His name is Daniel Hartley," Marla said. "He used to be a structural engineer. Lost his wife 6 years ago. His son's in foster care. He lives in a pickup truck behind an abandoned warehouse off 128th in Queens." Evelyn opened the file. The photo clipped to the top wasn't clear, but it was him, those eyes. Still and sad. The kind of eyes that had seen too much and spoken too little. "Does he know we found him?" she asked. Marla shook her head. "No. Do you want him to?" Evelyn looked out the window, where snow had begun to fall again, soft and soundless against the glass. "Yes," she said. It was dusk when Evelyn arrived. The driver hesitated when she asked to be dropped a block away. She wanted to walk the last part, needed to feel the distance between the worlds they lived in. Her boots crunched in the snow, breath visible as she passed graffiti-scarred walls and shuttered storefronts. She spotted the truck even before she reached it. Rusted, hunched against the cold like an animal in retreat. The small side window was covered in frost, but she saw the outline of him inside, motionless. She stood there a long moment before she lifted her hand and knocked gently on the glass. It took a second, then the door creaked open. Daniel stepped out, his breath catching when he saw her. He looked different in daylight, older, thinner, yet no less steady. His gaze flickered from her boots to her face to the coat still in her arms. "You found me," he said, voice rough from disuse. Evelyn nodded. "I couldn't stop thinking about what you did." He gave a small, rueful smile. "It was just a coat." "It wasn't." He looked down, his hands deep in the pockets of a thin hoodie. "People don't usually come here unless they want something. I wanted to say thank you," she said softly, "and to know your name." "Daniel." "I know," she admitted, cheeks flushed. "I asked someone to find you." He raised a brow, not quite surprised. "And what now, Evelyn Moore?" The sound of her name from his mouth startled her. He hadn't forgotten. "Now," she said, stepping closer, "I want to offer you something more than thanks." They sat on the back of the truck, legs dangling. He didn't ask for details. She didn't offer them. "Do you miss it?" she asked. He didn't need clarification. Every day, building things, watching them stand, knowing they had a purpose. "You still have one." "Not anymore," he said, not bitter, just tired. "Purpose needs foundation. I lost mine." She looked at him, really looked. "Then maybe," she said, "it's time to rebuild." In her lap, the coat sat folded between them like a silent bridge. And in the cold of that quiet Queen Street, Evelyn Moore extended the first invitation that wasn't born of pity or charity, but recognition. The beginning of a second chance. The hand that didn't pull back. Daniel Hartley had woken up that morning to the usual sounds of the city whispering just beyond the rust-rimmed walls of his truck. The wind hummed low through the alley where he parked each night, the rising sun making shadows of scaffolding dance across the fogged windshield. Another morning of small hopes and colder hands. He was pouring the last bit of instant coffee into a chipped tin mug when he heard the sound. Heels. Not the hurried, thoughtless kind. These steps were deliberate, sure-footed, echoing against the frost-kissed pavement like a bell in a cathedral. Daniel looked up and squinted. There she was, Evelyn Moore, standing in the morning chill, wearing a coat that didn't quite belong to her. His coat. He stood slowly, brushing crumbs from his jacketless arms, his breath fogging the air. "Miss, I think you might be lost," he said with the kind of guarded courtesy only someone who'd lived too long on the edge could perfect. Evelyn took a breath, pulled her scarf closer, and replied, "No, Daniel. I'm exactly where I need to be." His name on her lips did something to him, made the space between them shift. It wasn't just surprise. It was disbelief. "What do you know my name?" She held up a hand. "I didn't come here to pry. I came because you gave me something without asking. Not just a coat. You gave me kindness when the world has taught people to look away." Daniel narrowed his eyes, suspicion still rooted in his bones. Most people would just say thank you and keep walking. And most people aren't used to feeling something again after years of forgetting how, she said softly. "You didn't have to help me, but you did, and I haven't stopped thinking about it." He leaned back against the side of the truck, arms crossed, chin tucked. There was silence, not uncomfortable, just wide, like neither of them quite knew what came next. "You didn't owe me anything," he said, voice quieter. "Exactly," she replied, "which is why it meant so much." Evelyn looked down, fidgeted with the hem of the coat, then reached into her bag and pulled out something. A small, framed photo. She handed it to him. It was the drawing. Crayon on lined paper. The crooked sun, the uneven letters. "I love you, Dad Jonah." His breath hitched. "I thought you should have it back." Daniel held the frame like it might crumble. His thumb traced the edge, eyes blinking faster than the wind required. "I've forgotten I left it in there," he whispered. She nodded. "That drawing saved me more than I can explain. Not just because of Jonah, because it reminded me that everyone's carrying something, even people who seem invisible." Daniel looked up at her, something soft flickering in the hard blue of his eyes. "Why are you really here?" Evelyn looked around at the alley, at the sagging truck behind him, the chipped tin cup on the hood, then back at him. "Because I believe in second chances. Not as charity, as justice. And because I want to open a door. You don't have to walk through it, but I need you to know it's there." He exhaled slowly, as if the words cost him. "People don't offer people like me doors. Then maybe it's time they did." A silence settled again, this time gentler. Daniel looked at the drawing once more, then at the woman who'd returned it. "You keep the coat," he said. She smiled. "Then you keep the frame. Maybe put it somewhere warmer soon." His lips twitched into something that almost looked like a smile. For the first time in years, someone had not only seen him, they had come back. A place at the table. Daniel Hartley stood just outside the glass doors of Moore and Maven Technologies, collar pulled high against the wind, his breath catching in the crisp morning air. He stared up at the sleek high-rise, its mirrored surface reflecting a version of the city he no longer belonged to. Behind those glass walls, lives were lived in boardrooms and brainstorms, filled with schedules, catered lunches, and curated ambitions. Not long ago, he might have been one of them. Now, he felt like a man visiting a memory. Evelyn had called it an invitation. He called it a test. The night she appeared at his truck in Queens, her designer boots crunching gravel, she'd said, "I'm not offering charity, Daniel. I'm offering something honest. Come see it. Decide for yourself." He wasn't sure what he was deciding, but he showed up anyway. The security guard at the front desk blinked when Daniel gave his name. A moment later, Evelyn herself appeared, moving through the lobby with quiet authority, a simple gray dress and soft scarf, lending her the kind of elegance money couldn't fake. "You came," she said, her smile small but genuine. "I said I would." They rode the elevator in silence. Daniel glanced at the mirrored walls, catching his reflection. He'd worn his cleanest flannel shirt, boots scrubbed as best he could. His hands, though, still bore calluses from the day before's day labor. He stuffed them into his pockets. The conference room she led him to wasn't large, but it was warm, flooded with morning light and filled with small comforts. A carafe of coffee, a dish of lemon tea, a vase of fresh flowers. Not a typical boardroom. Evelyn gestured for him to sit. "You don't need to sell me anything," Daniel said, settling uneasily into the chair. "I'm not a culture consultant, Evelyn. I build things." "Exactly," she replied, folding her hands. "That's why you're here." He looked at her, waiting. "We're building a new department," she explained. "Not just about profits and pitches. About people. We call it HVC, Human Values and Culture. It's meant to keep our company accountable to what matters. And it needs someone real, someone who's lived through loss, who knows what it means to be overlooked. Daniel stared at her. I'm a man who lives in a truck, and that truck's seen more humanity than most corner offices. There was a pause. The hum of the city floated in through the glass. You know what kindness is, she continued. You gave your only coat to a stranger. You reminded me what it means to feel seen. That matters here. It should matter everywhere. He rubbed a hand over his face. What would I even do? Be you, she said simply. Listen, observe, offer perspective. Help us remember what kind of company we want to be. For a long moment, Daniel sat still. He thought of the years of silence, the nights spent in parking lots and the mornings in line at shelters. The way the world passed him by, mistaking silence for absence, poverty for failure. And yet, Evelyn had seen something. Not pity, not obligation, something else. You don't have to decide now, she said, voice quieter. But if you do say yes, there's a desk here, with your name on it. He stood, unsure what to say. But something had shifted. Not in the room, in him. A small tilt toward hope. I haven't signed a paycheck in over 7 years, he murmured. Then let this one be the first of something better. Daniel looked. Around the room again. The coffee. The light. The woman across from him who had once stood shivering at a bus stop, now offering him a key to a door he thought was long closed. I'll think about it, he said. That's all I ask. But even as he left, walking back into the noise and rush of the world outside, Daniel hardly felt something he hadn't in years. He felt seen, and maybe, just maybe, he was ready to start building again. The office with no title on the door. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, revealing the executive floor of Moore and Maven Technologies. It was a space designed to impress, cool tones, glass walls, minimalist furnishings that whispered power instead of shouting it. Daniel Hartley stepped out, unsure if his scuffed boots belonged anywhere near the polished marble floors. His shirt was clean but old, tucked neatly into faded jeans. The jacket he wore wasn't the one he had given Evelyn. That one she kept, and somehow it felt right that way. A young assistant with bright eyes greeted him. Mr. Hartley? MS. Moore's expecting you. Right this way. He nodded, clearing his throat, and followed her down a long hallway. Each step echoed more in his chest than in the corridor. Memories of job interviews from another life surfaced, back when he wore tailored suits and carried confidence like a second skin. That skin had long since weathered. At the end of the hall, the assistant opened a door without a nameplate. Here we are. The room was nothing like he expected. No sleek conference table, no intimidating boardroom. Instead, a small round table sat by the window, 2 mismatched chairs, a pot of tea already steeping. A view of the Hudson glinted behind soft curtains. Evelyn stood by the window, her heels off, barefoot on the plush rug. She turned when he entered, her expression somewhere between welcome and something gentler, something like hope. Danielle. Thanks for coming. He offered a hesitant smile. Couldn't say no after you found me behind a warehouse. She chuckled, motioning toward the chair opposite hers. Sit, please. This isn't an interview. Not like the kind you're used to. He lowered himself slowly, his body still stiff from sleeping in the truck. She poured 2 cups of tea, pushing one toward him. For a while, they sat in silence, sipping. Then Evelyn said, softly, I created a new role. It's not in our org chart. It doesn't have a title yet, but I think it's important. And I think you're the only one who could do it. Daniel blinked. Why me? Because you remind people of what matters. And in a place like this, that's easy to forget. She slid a folder toward him. Inside, instead of a contract or job description, were handwritten notes. Observations. Ideas. Quotes scribbled on napkins. At the top of the first page was a simple heading, the heart of the company. Daniel flipped through slowly. One page read, how we treat the receptionist matters more than what we tell the shareholders. Another, people are not resources. They are stories in motion. He looked up, eyes misted. You want me to? Be a reminder. Evelyn nodded. You'd be part mentor, part listener. You'd speak to new hires, sit in on meetings when decisions affect people, not just profits. You wouldn't be a mascot, Daniel. You'd be the soul in the room. Daniel leaned back. I was an engineer. I built bridges, schools, things that lasted. So build this with me, she said. Help me rebuild what work is supposed to feel like. He stared at the tea, then out the window. Snow was starting to fall again, soft and slow. You know, he said, his voice rough, when I gave you that coat, I wasn't thinking about anything noble. I just could not do it. That's exactly why it mattered, she replied. Silence settled again, comfortable this time. Finally, he nodded. Okay, I don't know what to call this, but I'm in. Evelyn smiled, a smile so unguarded it softened the whole room. Welcome to Moore and Maven, Daniel. Let's build something that feels like home. Outside, the snow kept falling. Inside, something rare had begun to take root. Not a job, not a second chance, but the quiet certainty that even the smallest ember of kindness could light the way forward. The door left slightly open. It started with a sticky note. Not a grand announcement or a formal HR memo, just a yellow square left on Daniel's desk one Monday morning, scribbled in a rushed hand. Lunch? Just need to talk. Gee. Daniel read it twice, smiled faintly, and tucked it into his pocket. It wasn't the first note he'd received that week or even that day. Over the past month, since joining Moore and Maven Technologies as the advisor for culture and human values, people had started leaving notes like breadcrumbs. Some with questions, some with nothing more than a name. Some just said, "Can I sit with you a while?" And Daniel, who once believed silence was all he had left to offer, had become someone others sought for quiet. That particular day, the note was from Jamie, a junior analyst who hadn't spoken more than 3 sentences in any meeting Daniel had attended. They met at a bench just outside the cafeteria, under a small awning dusted with winter frost. Jamie arrived holding a lunchbox but didn't open it. Daniel didn't press. They sat together for several minutes in silence, just watching people pass. Then Jamie whispered, "I don't know what I'm doing here." Daniel looked over, not startled. "You mean this company?" Jamie shook their head. "I mean, here, at all. Everything feels too loud, too fast, like I'm pretending I know how to be a person." Daniel nodded, slow and understanding. "Some days I feel like that too." Jamie glanced up, surprised. "But you're always so calm." "Calm doesn't mean I have the answers," Daniel said. "Sometimes it just means I've learned how to sit in the questions longer." They didn't say much more. But when Jamie stood to leave, they squeezed Daniel's shoulder lightly. That was all. Word of moments like that spread without ever needing to be told. People spoke softly about Daniel in hallways, whispered stories of how he listened without interrupting, how he made eye contact like it mattered. Someone started calling his office the quiet room. Another began baking extra muffins to leave on his desk, just because. Evelyn noticed. She watched from her glass-paneled office as teams who once barely looked up from their screens now gathered around Daniel's doorway. Meetings became less combative, emails less sharp. Once, she caught a senior developer kneeling to help an intern tie her shoe. A small act, but it shimmered in Evelyn's mind like sunlight on water. One afternoon, she stopped by Daniel's office herself. He was sketching something on a notepad, not a blueprint, but a diagram of interconnected circles. At the center, one word, belonging. She knocked gently. "Got a minute?" Daniel looked up and smiled. "Always." She sat across from him, glancing at the diagram. "You've changed this place." He shook his head. "No, I just left the door open." People walked through on their own. Evelyn exhaled, a long breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "I forgot how much that matters." They talked, not about projects or quarterly reports, but about silence, about grief, about how some people carry entire storms inside them and still show up every day. That night, Daniel walked out of the office building and paused beneath the street lamp. He pulled his collar tight against the cold. Above him, the sky was the color of pewter, snow beginning to fall again in lazy spirals. In his pocket was a new note, folded twice. This one simply read, "Thank you for not asking me to be okay." He stood for a long while, hand over that note, feeling something stir beneath the layers of worn flannel and years of hardened silence. In the quiet, he smiled, because in this place, he hadn't just found a job. He had found the beginnings of home, a key and a place to breathe. The key didn't look like much, just a small piece of brass, worn at the edges and attached to a plain ring. But when Daniel Hartley slid it into the lock of the little blue house on the corner of Waverly and Maple, his hand trembled. The door creaked as he opened it, and for the first time in years, he stepped not into a borrowed space or a temporary shelter, but into his own home. The house was modest. 2 bedrooms, a sagging porch with chipped white railings, and a tiny patch of earth out back barely wide enough for a tomato plant or 2. But to Daniel, it was a palace. A place with a door he could close behind him. A place where he didn't have to sleep with one eye open or hide his past behind silence. It smelled faintly of dust, paint, and promise. Jonah arrived the next afternoon with a duffel bag and a nervous smile. 19 now, his once boyish face had grown into angles and stubble, but the look in his eyes when he saw the house mirrored Daniel's own. He dropped the bag inside the doorway and turned to his father. "So, this is it." Daniel nodded, suddenly unsure if it was enough. "It's not much, but it's ours." Jonah didn't say anything. He just walked to the kitchen, opened a cabinet, and smiled when he saw the mismatched mugs Daniel had picked up from the thrift store. He turned back. "It's perfect." They spent the next few days assembling their life piece by piece. They painted the living room a soft gray, set up Jonah's desk near the front window, and argued playfully about where the couch should go. Daniel showed Jonah how to reseal a drafty window and fix a leaky pipe under the sink. It wasn't fancy, but it was the kind of quiet labor that built something deeper than comfort. On Sunday morning, they went to the local farmer's market and picked out tomato and basil seedlings. Daniel watched Jonah kneel in the dirt and gently press the plants into the ground. The boy had always had a careful touch. That evening, they sat on the porch eating spaghetti and garlic. Bread off paper plates. The sky turned pink and gold behind the trees, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. The quiet between them was not the silence of strangers, but of 2 hearts learning to beat in rhythm again. "You kept your promise," Jonas said softly, twirling spaghetti with a plastic fork. Daniel looked over, startled. "What promise?" "That you'd come back for me. That you'd make it okay again." Daniel swallowed hard. He wanted to say he hadn't done enough, that he was still rebuilding, that he carried more guilt than anyone should. But instead, he nodded. "I never stopped trying." Jonah reached into his backpack and pulled out an old crayon drawing, faded, edges curled. 2 stick figures under a crooked sun, labeled Dad and me. "I kept this," Jonah said. "All these years. I always believed you'd come back." Daniel felt the lump rise in his throat. He reached out and gently took the drawing, holding it like something sacred. A breeze passed, lifting the smell of warm earth and garlic. In the distance, wind chimes sang a quiet melody. And in that tiny house on Waverly and Maple, for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Daniel Hartley exhaled. He was home. Bricks, bread, and quiet repairs. There were no violins, no confessions under the rain, no cinematic embraces in crowded streets. What happened between Daniel and Evelyn in the weeks after his first day at Moore and Maven was quieter, like watching the slow thaw of a winter long settled. Daniel moved into a modest apartment on the edge of Brooklyn, arranged discreetly by HR as part of his onboarding package. It wasn't anything glamorous, a 1-bedroom on the 2nd floor of a red brick walk-up with creaky floors and a heater that wheezed in protest some nights. But it had walls, a mailbox with his name on it, a fridge that hummed softly in the dark like a lullaby. For a man who had called the back of a rusting Chevy home for nearly 2 years, it was nothing short of sanctuary. He spent his days at Moore and Maven not managing spreadsheets or presenting in boardrooms, but sitting in a corner office, repurposed from what used to be a seldom-used meditation room, talking to people, listening. His door was always open, and slowly employees began trickling in. At first, they were hesitant, curious about the older man with no badge, no title that made sense. But then the interns came, and the temp workers, then the junior developers, and the overworked product managers. They came with stories of burnout, of imposter syndrome, of sick parents, broken marriages, pressure too heavy to carry alone. Daniel didn't offer solutions. He offered his presence. Sometimes, just the sentence, "You're not alone in this," was all someone needed to fall apart safely. Evelyn watched from afar at first, skeptical of how deeply one man's quiet empathy could affect an entire company's rhythm. But she saw it, how the energy in the hallway shifted, how managers paused to ask, "Are you really okay?" Not as a formality, but with sincerity. She noticed less absenteeism, fewer resignation letters, more eye contact. She visited Daniel's office one Thursday afternoon under the pretense of checking in on a new wellness initiative. He was reading a handwritten letter from a temp worker who had decided not to leave the company after a long conversation with him. He looked up when she entered, smiling in that tired, weathered way of his. "You ever notice," he asked, gesturing to the note, "that the smallest things can weigh the most?" Evelyn sat, unexpectedly, across from him. "You're becoming the heart of this place, Daniel." He shook his head. "I'm just an old guy with a warm cup of coffee and some time." "That's more than most," she said, and meant it. That weekend, she showed up at his building unannounced, 2 paper cups in hand, wind teasing her hair. He opened the door, still wearing his old flannel shirt, looking surprised. "I figured," she said, holding up the coffee, "if you're going to keep changing the world one person at a time, you should at least have caffeine." He let her in. There was no ceremony, no agenda, just warmth. They spent the afternoon unpacking a bookshelf together, donated by a neighbor moving to Florida. As she handed him dusty old titles, manuals from his days as an engineer, yellowing novels he couldn't bear to part with, she saw a different kind of man. One who once designed bridges, but now built trust with nothing but presence. One who had lost everything, yet still opened doors without being asked. In the evenings that followed, Evelyn would sometimes stop by after work, her heels clicking softer now. They'd eat leftovers on mismatched plates, watch old westerns. Sometimes she'd bring her laptop and sit silently beside him while he read. No need for words. The quiet between them wasn't awkward. It was shelter. One night, the lights flickered out during a sudden spring storm. Daniel, ever prepared, lit candles and opened a window, just enough to hear the rain. Evelyn stood there, barefoot in his 2 large socks, cradling a warm mug. She looked around the dim, candlelit room, the faint smell of wood polish and garlic lingering from dinner, and she whispered, "It's strange." "What is?" "This feels like home." Daniel didn't respond. He just smiled gently and handed her a blanket. She didn't leave that night, and though nothing was declared, nothing named, something between them shifted. Not in dramatic ways, but in the slow, steady beat of 2 people rediscovering what it meant to be safe with someone else. The next morning, Evelyn woke before sunrise. She tiptoed around the tiny kitchen, making coffee while Daniel still slept on the couch, blanket barely covering his feet. She watched him for a long moment, the way his brow was relaxed, how his fingers curled slightly near his chest like he was still holding something delicate in his dreams. She poured a second cup and waited. When he stirred and saw her there, coffee waiting, sun beginning to stretch across the floor, he said nothing. But the look in his eyes was louder than any thank you could have been. And so, life continued, not with sweeping changes or declarations of love, but with doorbells and dinners, with shared silences and parallel tasks. With her head on his shoulder during movie nights, with his jacket offered even when she swore she didn't need it. For Daniel, it was the slow return of rhythm. For Evelyn, it was the first time in decades she let herself rest without performance. They didn't need to rush. Healing, after all, isn't loud. It's the whisper between heartbeats, the pause between words, the quiet trust of knowing someone will still be there tomorrow and the day after that. And they were. The porch light always on. The new house was nothing like the one Daniel Hartley once built for Lily and Jonah in the suburbs of Jersey. That one had a wraparound porch, a lemon tree in the yard, and crown molding that took him 3 weekends to finish. This house, this new beginning, was smaller, older, and came with creaky floorboards and cabinets that stuck in humid weather. But it had something the other never had, the quiet promise of healing. The first morning after they moved in, Evelyn brewed coffee in the narrow kitchen as Daniel stood outside on the front porch, staring at the neighborhood. It was an odd mix. Young families with chalk on driveways, retirees who knew everyone's dog's name, a mailman who whistled old Sinatra tunes. Daniel exhaled, slow and steady. For the first time in years, he wasn't bracing himself for a knock on the truck window, a citation, or the sound of footsteps that meant he had to move again. No one would ask him to leave this time. The deed sat in the drawer beside the sink, a thin rectangle of legalese that somehow felt more like a love letter than a contract. Evelyn joined him with 2 mugs of coffee, one chipped and mismatched. She handed him the one with faded sunflowers and leaned against the railing. "You didn't sleep much," she said, her voice still laced with morning rasp. "I haven't slept in a real bed in so long," Daniel replied, then cracked a smile. "My back's confused." Evelyn chuckled, sipping from her mug. "You get used to it. Stability. It's not overrated." The sun filtered through the thin clouds, casting pale gold across the porch. For a while, they stood in silence. But it wasn't the kind that weighs, it was the kind that breathes. That week, Daniel started his new role at Moore & Maven. It was awkward at first. He walked the glass-paneled halls in clean but second-hand dress shirts, feeling like an imposter among buttoned-up executives and interns who typed faster than he could think. He had no badge, no impressive resume, no LinkedIn endorsements. But Evelyn insisted on one thing. "You're not here because of where you've been. You're here because of who you are." He didn't sit in on board meetings or run quarterly projections. He did something rarer. He listened. He brought a thermos of black coffee, a small notebook, and he sat in the common spaces, the cafe, the stairwell bench, the quiet corner near the elevators. People found him. At first, just a trickle. A marketing associate unsure if her work had meaning. A junior developer who couldn't sleep from stress. Then others. A security guard grieving his wife. A senior exec trying to figure out how to apologize to his daughter after missing her graduation. They came because Daniel didn't fix, he understood. He asked questions like, "What was the last thing that made you laugh so hard you cried?" Or, "When did you stop writing poetry?" He had a way of pulling memory out from beneath layers of professionalism. Back home, life took on rhythm. Evelyn would leave notes in the lunch he packed, quotes from books, sometimes a terrible joke. Jonah, now a college sophomore, visited every weekend, bringing laundry and stories from campus. The 3 of them would sit on the porch in the evenings, a fire pit, crackling in the yard, sometimes playing music from a Bluetooth speaker, other times just listening to crickets. Daniel planted a small garden behind the house, tomatoes, herbs, sunflowers for Evelyn. He built a bench with his own hands and carved their initials into the underside, not for display, but for memory. One afternoon, Daniel got a letter in the mail. The envelope was plain. No return address. Inside was a child's drawing, stick figures, a sun, and a crooked house with home scrawled across the roof. A note. "Thank you for talking to my mom that day. She came home and smiled again. We hadn't seen that in a while. She said she met someone at work who reminded her that kindness still exists." Daniel stared at the drawing a long time. He showed it to Evelyn that evening. She didn't say anything, just reached out and squeezed his hand. In the months that followed, Moore and Maven launched a new internal initiative called Human First. It was simple, anonymous letters of appreciation. Each employee could write to another. No titles, no departments, just one human to another. The idea had been Daniel's, born from a single crayon drawing in his pocket. It caught on. Letters pinned to corkboards, tucked in lockers, slipped under office doors. He watched as the company he once thought was too sharp, too corporate, began to soften around the edges. One evening, as he was leaving the office, Evelyn met him at the elevator. She looked tired, but the kind of tired that came from purpose. "You know what the head of design said today?" she asked, walking with him to the garage. "What's that?" She said she started a meeting today by asking, "What matters to you outside of work?" She said it changed the whole room. Daniel grinned. "You started a ripple." "No," she said, bumping his shoulder gently. "You did." Later that week, it rained. Daniel stood by the window, watching water race down the glass in threads. Evelyn was curled on the couch, a blanket draped over her legs, a book in her lap. A candle flickered on the coffee table. Outside, the world looked washed and new. He walked over, sat beside her, and leaned in close. "You ever think about how it all started?" he asked. "The rain." He chuckled. "No. Us. The coat. The bus stop. Evelyn smiled, closed her book. I think about it all the time. He looked at her, the woman who had gone from stranger to something much deeper. I didn't know you were anyone important. I wasn't, she said softly. Not until someone reminded me to be. Daniel reached into the drawer of the coffee table and pulled out the crumpled sketch Jonah had made when he was 5, a house, a dad, and a son. He'd carried it through every season of loss. Now it sat in a frame by the doorway. We made it, he said. Evelyn leaned her head on his shoulder. We're still making it. And they were. Not in grand declarations or perfect days, but in the quiet. In mismatched mugs and Tuesday dinners, in handwritten notes and early morning walks. In every good night, and be safe, and I'm here. The porch light stayed on every evening, not for guests or show, but because one winter long ago, kindness had lit the path home, and they'd never forgotten it. Harbor House had never been glamorous by the standards of any wedding magazine. Its walls were worn red brick. Its lighting came from twinkling string lights hung across the ceiling and colorful paper lanterns painted by children in the community art program. But tonight, it glowed in a way no luxe measurement could ever capture, with laughter, warmth, and the presence of people who had once known deep loss, yet still chose love. Daniel stood before the mismatched wooden chairs in a suit gifted by a former colleague, carefully ironed, buttons stitched back on. His hands clutched a piece of paper folded in quarters. Vows he had written the night before, when sleep refused to come because he couldn't stop thinking of the look in Evelyn's eyes when she had asked, "Have you ever thought about starting over?" Evelyn entered with 2 young girls, the first children she'd ever successfully sponsored from Harbor House. She held no bouquet of expensive flowers, just a small bundle of dried lavender and a scrap of cloth embroidered with the word hope by single mothers who had once stayed in her shelter. There was no priest, only Marla, the head of the community education program, who stood to officiate. Her voice, soft and raspy with age, carried steady warmth. We gather here today not to witness perfection, but to bless 2 people who have known what it means to break, to lose, to believe they were no longer lovable. And yet, they found each other, not in sparkle, but in a cold night, under a street lamp, through a quiet act of kindness. That's where love began. Evelyn smiled, eyes misty. When Daniel looked at her, he didn't see a CEO. He saw the woman who had returned to him the meaning of home, not as an address, but as a heart willing to stay open. He unfolded the paper, voice trembling. I once built bridges, homes, highways. But I never thought I could build a home out of a small gesture. You came from a world I never thought had room for a man sleeping in a truck, living off threadbare hope. But you came, and you didn't ask anything when I gave you my coat. And from that, I learned that love doesn't require conditions. You're not my second chance. You're the reason I believe in the first. I promise not to disappear. I will be present, through sun or snow, success or failure. I choose to stay. Every day, Evelyn didn't need notes. She held his hands, eyes steady. Someone once asked me, what makes a CEO like me fall in love with someone who used to be homeless? I didn't answer, because love doesn't need a reason to exist. It just needs someone in the most vulnerable moment to still choose to give. That night, you gave me your last coat, not because I needed it, but because you couldn't let someone freeze alone. I've lived a life where logic ran everything. Companies, people, my own emotions. But since meeting you, I've learned to live with my heart. And I choose you. Not because you once saved me from the cold, but because you brought me a warmth money can't buy. Soft sobs stirred among the guests. Jonah, Daniel's son, stood silently at the side, brushing away tears. He knew the days his father had lived, where even a kind glance could break him. But now his father stood tall, not because he was rescued, but because someone stood beside him in love, not pity. When Marla asked, "Do you accept this person, not as your perfect half, but as your equal partner in all their imperfection?" They both answered at once, "Yes." Ido. Applause erupted, not loud, but full, like warm winds rushing in after a long winter. The small reception was held outside, under hand-painted banners and flickering string lights pulsing like the heartbeats of children. The wedding cake was made by the owner of the bakery near the bus stop, the same woman Evelyn had once helped get surgery funding for her husband. The chairs didn't match. The tablecloths were sewn by single mothers in the sewing group, but no one cared. Because the real light wasn't in uniformity. It was in the way eyes met, full of gratitude. Daniel and Evelyn didn't dance like in the movies. They simply stood together, smiling as they watched Jonah awkwardly trying to slow dance with a young girl from Harbor House to a country song playing from an old Bluetooth speaker. Their first hug after the vows wasn't long, but it was enough to assure them that neither of them was alone anymore. At the end of the night, Daniel sat alone for a moment, looking up at the starlit sky, fingers brushing over the fabric of his old suit, and he smiled. At last, he understood. Love didn't arrive in grand gestures. It arrived on a cold night, through a coat, and a person who stopped. Not for any reason but compassion. Each morning at Moore and Maven Technologies began the same way. Coffee machines humming, emails firing off, the glass walls of offices reflecting ambition. But there was one room tucked into the corner of the 5th floor that didn't hum. It breathed. Daniel Hartley called it the listening room, though no sign marked the door. Word spread, not through memos, but through whispers. Employees who had once avoided eye contact in elevators began seeking him out. At first, it was just interns, shy, uncertain, weighed down by the pressure to prove themselves. Then came junior analysts, developers, and finally managers. It wasn't therapy, Daniel would say. It was just a place where the clock slowed, and people remembered they were more than what their job titles said. The room was simple. 2 mismatched armchairs, a small wooden table with a bowl of peppermints, a worn bookshelf filled with secondhand novels and poetry, and a pot of coffee, always warm. A soft lamp lit the space like a lantern in fog. He listened. That's all. And when he spoke, he didn't fix, he reflected. Sometimes, he once said to a young designer who had broken down in tears after a failed pitch, "It's not the work that breaks us, but the silence we sit in after." People came to sit in that silence with him. And slowly, things changed. Not drastically, not in the ways that made headlines, but subtly. Laughter returned to the break rooms. Colleagues began noticing when someone looked tired. One morning, Daniel arrived to find a sticky note on his door. "Thank you for making space for the parts of us we didn't know we could bring to work." Outside the office, Evelyn watched. She didn't interfere. Instead, she found herself drawn to the edges of that room, lingering in the hallway, sipping tea and listening to the low murmur of voices through the half-open door. Once, she watched as a senior executive emerged, eyes red but face lighter, as if a heavy coat had been lifted from his shoulders. Evelyn remembered that coat. One afternoon, she stepped inside. Daniel looked up from his chair and smiled gently. "Didn't think I'd see you on this side of the glass," he said. She sat, not as CEO, just as Evelyn. They talked, not about company goals or quarterly reports, but about loneliness, about what it meant to succeed and still feel hollow, about the pressure to hold everything together while feeling everything fall apart. When she left the room an hour later, she didn't feel cured. She felt real, and that was enough. One by one, more came. Some sat in silence, others rambled, a few wept. Daniel never hurried them. He offered coffee, not solutions. Presents, not prescriptions. That winter, Harbor House, a community center Evelyn had quietly funded for years, offered Daniel a space. He converted it into a public version of a listening room. Word spread again, this time beyond corporate halls. A single father came after losing his job. A teacher reeling from burnout. A retired nurse who hadn't spoken to her children in years. They sat in Daniel's mismatched chairs, surrounded by secondhand books and the warm, steady cadence of a man who knew what it meant to lose everything and still give. And each of them left with something they hadn't had in a long time, a little more room to breathe. Daniel didn't rebuild bridges with blueprints anymore. He rebuilt people, gently, quietly, one listening moment at a time. And in that, he found the part of himself he thought had been buried in snow. The room where people heal was never about the room. It was about the choice to sit down, to stay, to hear, and be heard. And that choice, repeated in quiet corners across the city, changed everything, even if the world never knew it. The day he truly returned. The hum of morning filled Morin Maven's central atrium like a quiet heartbeat. Keyboards clicking, footsteps padding softly on polished floors, and the soft chime of the espresso machine in the corner cafe. Daniel Hartley sat in a small office tucked away near the employee wellness lounge, the faint scent of pine lingering from the small desk plan a young intern had brought him for luck. Outside his window, the skyline blazed gold in the early sun, but inside him, something else was slowly beginning to glow, a quiet sense of belonging. He'd been with the company just over 2 months. They'd given him a badge with his name on it, a key card, a place to hang his coat. But this morning felt different. Daniel glanced down at the schedule Evelyn's assistant had left on his desk. 10 a.m. Roundtable with new hires. 2 p.m. Mentorship session. He turned it over and stared at the back, blank but somehow heavy, like the day was trying to tell him something. Then came the knock. A light tapping. Familiar. The door creaked open before he could speak. Evelyn stepped inside, holding 2 mugs of coffee. She handed one to him without a word and settled into the chair across from his desk, her tailored coat open, cheeks slightly flushed from the cold. Daniel raised an eyebrow, smiling softly. "Is this a check-in or a bribe?" "Neither," she replied, her voice softer than usual. "It's a visit. I needed to be here this morning." He sipped his coffee. "Everything okay?" Evelyn looked down for a moment, then met his eyes. "Do you remember what today is?" Daniel searched her face, then the calendar. Nothing obvious. She took a breath. It's been exactly 1 year. Since that night. The bus stop. Daniel stilled. The snow. Her shivering. His coat. She smiled faintly, reading the silence in his pause. Strange, isn't it? How something so small becomes the fault line between the life you had and the one you never expected. He nodded, throat tight. "It doesn't feel like a year." "It doesn't," she agreed. "And yet, here we are." They sat quietly for a moment, both lost in memory. Then Evelyn reached in her coat pocket and drew out a folded envelope. "I was going to wait until the company celebration tonight," she said, handing it over. "But it's personal." Daniel hesitated, then opened the envelope. Inside was a simple invitation card. On the front, a photo of the community center Evelyn had once told him about, Thomas's place. On the back, in her handwriting, "One kindness day. This time it's for you." He looked up. "You're dedicating it to the man who reminded me how powerful quiet love can be," she finished. "It's not a gala. No press. Just people. Stories. A moment to breathe." Daniel felt the weight of it settle in his chest like warmth after a long, cold walk. "Thank you," he said simply, voice rough around the edges. "There's more," Evelyn added. She stood, pacing gently toward the window, hands clasped behind her back. "I've been watching this place change, Daniel. Not just metrics or morale, but people. The way they talk. The way they listen now. You did that." He shook his head. "I didn't do anything. I just sat with them, asked how they were, paid attention." "Exactly." She turned to face him again. "And that kind of presence, that kind of steady human gravity, it's rare." Daniel looked down, searching for the right words. "I'm not used to being seen, Evelyn. Not like this. For a long time, I didn't even see myself." "I know," she said gently. "That's why I want you to speak tonight." His eyes shot up. "Speak? At the event?" She nodded. "Just 5 minutes. Say whatever you want, or nothing at all. But you're the reason we're gathering. You're the one who reminded us what kindness looks like when no one's watching." Daniel exhaled. His hands trembled just a little, but he placed them calmly over the envelope. "I'll try," he said. That evening, the community center glowed like a lighthouse in the late winter dusk. Children's laughter echoed from the hallways. Candles flickered on tables lined with handwritten notes and paper hearts. In the center of the main room, framed on the wall, hung the coat, his coat. The one he'd given without hesitation. Below it, the plaque read, "One small act of kindness can change a life. Sometimes it changes too." The room was filled with quiet conversation. Volunteers, employees, friends, people who had known hardship and healing alike. Evelyn stood near the entryway, her gaze scanning the crowd until it landed on Daniel. He'd arrived early, alone, dressed in a plain blue shirt and an old sports coat someone had gifted him. But he wore it like it belonged to him. When it was time, Evelyn walked to the front and took the mic. She didn't introduce herself, didn't give a speech. She simply smiled and said, "There's someone here tonight who reminded me, and all of us, what it means to give without expectation." Then she turned to Daniel. "Would you join me?" He stood slowly, every eye turning his way. But none judged, none measured. They waited, curious, open. Daniel stepped up, took the mic, and held it for a moment before speaking. "I used to think the world forgot people like me," he began, voice low but steady. "And maybe it did. But even in the coldest parts of my life, I still had the power to give something." He paused, scanning the room. That night, I didn't know Evelyn. I didn't know who she was or what she had. I just saw someone who was cold, and I had a coat. A few people smiled. One woman wiped her eyes. I didn't expect anything in return. And for a long time before that, I didn't expect much of myself either. He looked at Evelyn then, a quiet gratitude in his eyes. But that night changed everything. Not just because of what I gave, but because someone reminded me that I still mattered. He turned to the crowd. "You matter too, no matter where you are, no matter what you've lost. And sometimes, all it takes is showing up, even if all you have is a coat." The room rose in soft applause, not loud or roaring, but warm like shared breath in winter. That night, after the candles dimmed and the tables cleared, Evelyn found Daniel standing outside beneath the stars. "You did well," she said, stepping beside him. He chuckled, still shaking. "That means it mattered." He turned to her. "Do you ever regret it? Coming to find me?" She shook her head. "It was never about finding you. It was about not losing the part of me that saw you." And in that silence, wrapped in frost and memory, they stood together, two lives, once unraveling, now stitched back by something far quieter than success. Something called grace. In today's fast-paced world, where success is often measured by paychecks and job titles, the story of Daniel Hartley and Evelyn Moore reminds us that a person's true worth doesn't lie in their status or past, but in their kindness, especially the kind that asks for nothing in return. When Daniel, a man who had nothing left but an old coat and memories of family he lost, chose to give the only thing he had to a stranger in the freezing cold, he had no idea that simple act would open a new door for him. But perhaps more important than what came after was this: he didn't wait until he had enough to give. He gave because his heart was still warm enough to care. In today's world, it's easy to get caught up in achievements, comparisons, and the standard society sets. But this story urges us to pause and ask ourselves, how many times have we missed the chance to offer something good? Not because we didn't have it, but because we didn't think it was enough to make a difference? A coat, a compassionate glance, a simple "Are you okay?" Sometimes that's all it takes for someone to feel seen. Evelyn, a woman who once believed she was strong enough to face everything alone, had to relearn the value of connection and the pain of wounds that never quite healed from childhood. And she didn't hide that. She chose to act. She didn't just help Daniel find shelter. She created a role where he could pass on the most valuable thing he had left: his humanity, in a tech-driven world that had nearly forgotten it. That choice didn't just save a person. It slowly warmed an entire organization. This story isn't just a heartwarming tale. It's a mirror, reflecting what we can all do each day. It reminds us that every act of kindness, no matter how small, has the power to reach someone's heart. And that sometimes healing doesn't begin with something grand. It begins by believing that no matter how little we think we have, we still have something to give. In a world often torn by division and hardship, be like Daniel, a man who chose kindness, even when life had been unkind to him. Because that choice, made quietly and without fanfare, is what builds a better world, one moment at a time. Before we go, I'd love to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Are you tuning in from the heartland of America, a quiet countryside, or maybe a bustling city dreaming of open fields? Drop a comment. Below, I read every single one. And if this story touched your heart, inspired you, or simply gave you a moment of warmth in your day, Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss another uplifting story like this. Thank you so much for being here. Your support means everything, and I can't wait to bring you more heartfelt stories soon. Until next time, stay kind, stay inspired, and I'll see you in the next one.